While my wife was supposedly negotiating a commercial real estate deal in Seattle, I decided to repaint her home office as a surprise for her 60th birthday. Lifting a heavy oil painting off the wall, I uncovered a microscopic fracture in the drywall, hiding a recessed security mechanism. Bypassing the panel revealed a steel drawer containing 5 passports, with her face 5 different names, and a $15 million life insurance policy on my life, with a double indemnity accidental death clause enacted exactly 48 hours ago. Before I reveal what stepped through my front door seconds later, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever trusted the wrong person and had to orchestrate your own survival. The afternoon sun filtered through the plantation shutters of our suburban Chicago home, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I stood on a sturdy aluminum stepladder, carefully pressing blue painter's tape along the edge of the mahogany crown molding. Diana had always protected her office space with fierce territoriality, claiming her real estate files required absolute privacy. She left for Seattle yesterday morning, giving me a pristine 3-day window to refresh the faded eggshell paint to a vibrant pearl white. She was turning 60 tomorrow. I wanted to present her with a revitalized sanctuary upon her return, a gesture of quiet devotion from a retired logistics auditor who preferred actions over grand declarations. I stepped down from the ladder and approached the centerpiece of the room. A massive, heavy replica of a Dutch landscape hung on the primary wall, anchored by thick steel wire. The frame dug into my palms as I hoisted the cumbersome piece off its reinforced mounting hooks. I rested the canvas gently against the leather sofa, turning back to prep the exposed wall surface. My eyes immediately caught an anomaly. My entire career had been built on identifying discrepancies in supply chains and financial ledgers, training my brain to spot structural irregularities instantly. A faint, almost imperceptible square outline broke the smooth texture of the drywall, measuring exactly 6 inches across. I ran my fingertips over the perimeter of the hidden square. The edges were perfectly flush, masked by a thin layer of specialized architectural putty designed to mimic standard wall texture. Pressing firmly against the center of the outline yielded a slight mechanical give. I applied more targeted pressure to the top right corner. A sharp metallic click echoed from behind the plaster. The 6-inch section of drywall popped forward seamlessly on hidden spring-loaded hinges. I pulled the panel aside, exposing a dark, recessed cavity between the wooden wall studs. Inside the void rested a sleek, matte black steel lockbox equipped with a biometric thumbprint scanner and a manual override slot. I stared at the electronic device, feeling a strange chill creep into my chest. Diana had never mentioned installing a wall safe. I reached into my tool belt, retrieving a narrow flathead screwdriver. Examining the edge of the biometric pad, I noticed a tiny secondary release catch, likely designed for battery failures. I wedged the steel tip of the screwdriver into the microscopic gap and applied upward leverage. The casing shifted, triggering the analog release mechanism. The heavy steel drawer slid forward silently on oiled tracks, stopping with a soft thud. I illuminated the contents with my pocket flashlight, bracing myself for hidden financial documents, or perhaps private jewelry. The beam of light reflected off the glossy covers of 5 distinct national passports, stacked neatly on the left side of the velvet-lined tray. I picked up the top booklet, flipping it open to the identification page. Diana's face stared back at me, capturing her sharp jawline and icy blue eyes perfectly. The name printed beside her photograph was entirely foreign. The nationality listed was Canadian. I snatched up the second passport. The same photograph, a different alias, an Australian citizenship. The third, fourth, and fifth documents followed the exact same pattern, providing her with fully authenticated identities across Europe and South America. These were not cheap forgeries. They were high-grade government-issued exit strategies. I set the passports down, my hands growing numb. Beneath the false identities lay a thick, hand-bound black leather ledger. I opened the heavy cover. The pages were densely packed with handwritten alphanumeric codes, routing numbers, and corresponding offshore bank coordinates. My auditing background allowed me to instantly decipher the financial architecture scrawled across the paper. These were routing logs for shell companies stationed in zero-tax jurisdictions. Massive sums of capital numbering in the tens of millions were flowing through these accounts in a highly synchronized laundering operation. Diana was not just a successful local real estate broker. She was operating a massive illicit financial network right under my roof. My breathing grew shallow as I reached for the final item resting at the bottom of the steel drawer. It was a thick manila envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. I broke the seal and extracted a pristine stack of legal documents bearing the watermarked logo of a premier international insurance conglomerate. The bold header across the first page identified the paperwork as a comprehensive executive life insurance policy. I scanned the primary insured individual section. My full legal name, Vincent, was printed in bold, undeniable ink. I flipped rapidly to the beneficiary designation. Diana was listed as the sole recipient of the entire payout, retaining absolute control over the dispersal of funds. I ran my index fingers down the column of figures, stopping abruptly at the core valuation. The base policy guaranteed a staggering payout of $15 million upon my expiration. I had never undergone a medical examination for this coverage, meaning Diana had utilized her extensive broker connections to forge my signature and falsify my health records. The sheer magnitude of the coverage indicated a profound level of premeditation. I turned to the secondary clauses, searching the fine print for the specific operational triggers. My eyes locked onto a freshly added addendum buried on the fourth page. It was a legally binding double indemnity clause. The legal language was explicit and ruthless. If my death were to be ruled the result of an unforeseen accident or a sudden catastrophic medical failure, the insurance payout would immediately double to $30 million. I checked the execution date stamped at the bottom of the final page. The notary seal confirmed the policy, and its lethal addendum had gone into active effect exactly 48 hours ago. The timeline crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Diana had activated a $30 million bounty on my head 2 days before boarding a flight to the West Coast. She did not travel to Seattle to attend a commercial real estate conference. She traveled across the country to establish an ironclad geographical alibi. The house was completely silent, yet the air felt incredibly heavy, suffocating my lungs. The paint supplies rested uselessly on the floor. I stood paralyzed in front of the open wall safe, gripping the execution order bearing my own name. Diana possessed 5 distinct exit strategies, an untraceable offshore financial empire, and a freshly minted motive to ensure my life ended abruptly before the weekend concluded. I needed to photograph every document, secure the evidence, and contact federal authorities immediately. I reached into my pocket to retrieve my smartphone to scan the insurance policy. Before my fingers could grasp the device, a sharp, rhythmic vibration pulsed against my thigh. I pulled the phone out and glanced at the illuminated screen. A bright red notification banner dominated the display, generated by the encrypted home security application I had installed last year. The text alerted me that the primary front door sensor had just been tripped. A secondary alert instantly followed, confirming the digital deadbolt had been disarmed using Diana's unique passcode. The heavy oak front door groaned open downstairs, echoing clearly up the hardwood staircase. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossed the marble floor of the foyer, moving steadily toward the base of the stairs leading directly to the office. I shoved the heavy stack of forged passports and the leather-bound ledger back into the dark recess of the wall. The thick steel drawer glided shut, sealing with a definitive mechanical click that vibrated through my fingertips. I grabbed the massive Dutch landscape painting from the leather sofa and hoisted it upward. My muscles strained as I hooked the thick steel wire onto the reinforced wall mounts. The canvas settled flush against the drywall, entirely concealing the microscopic fracture that hid the biometric scanner. I spun around and snatched a dripping paint roller from the plastic tray on the floor. I slapped the wet roller against the wall just as the brass handle of the office door turned. Diana stepped into the room. She was supposed to be in Seattle negotiating a commercial real estate deal. Instead, she stood before me wearing a tailored charcoal trench coat and carrying a leather travel bag. She dropped her keys onto the mahogany credenza. Her eyes bypassed my face entirely and locked directly onto the painting. I maintained a steady heart rate. I played the role of the devoted, slightly clumsy husband. I forced a warm smile and apologized for the mess. I told her I wanted to surprise her for her 60th birthday by freshening up her workspace. Diana forced a smile in return, but the muscles around her mouth were completely rigid. She complained about the harsh chemical smell of the wet paint and asked me to stop immediately. I agreed enthusiastically, setting the roller down and wiping my hands on a rag. I watched her face with absolute precision. Long before I spent 30 years auditing supply chains and financial ledgers for multinational corporations, I served 4 years in military signals intelligence. I spent thousands of hours analyzing interrogation tapes in windowless rooms. I learned how to decode human deception by isolating involuntary physiological responses. I knew exactly what acute suppressed panic looked like. Diana poured herself a glass of red wine in the kitchen. Her breathing was slightly too fast. Her left eyelid gave a microscopic twitch. Her knuckles turned stark white around the delicate glass stem. She claimed her real estate conference had concluded early due to a scheduling conflict. It was a flawless, rehearsed lie. I nodded and asked mundane questions about her flight. I watched my wife of 35 years weave a fabricated narrative without missing a single beat. The betrayal cut straight to the bone, but my military training overrode the emotional shock. Emotion is a fatal liability in a hostile environment. Information is the only currency of survival. I told her the painting had exhausted my back and feigned a slight limp as I walked toward the master bedroom. I needed to reinforce her perception of my age and physical vulnerability. I needed her to believe I was nothing more than an oblivious old man preparing for retirement. At 2 a.m, the house settled into absolute silence. I rose from the mattress. Diana was breathing deeply beside me, the heavy wine pulling her into a deep sleep. I slipped out of the bedroom and navigated the dark hallway from memory, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. I entered her office and approached her sleek silver laptop resting on the glass desk. I did not attempt to guess her password. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a modified universal serial bus bypass drive. I built the device years ago to test corporate network vulnerabilities for my clients. I inserted the metal drive into the side port of her computer. The main screen remained completely dark, but a tiny green light on the drive began to pulse rhythmically. The device bypassed the operating system entirely silently, cloning the encrypted hard drive sector by sector. I stood in the pitch-black room for 12 agonizing minutes. Every shift of the house settling sounded like a gunshot in the quiet air. The green light eventually stopped pulsing and turned solid. The data extraction was complete. I removed the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and left the office exactly as I had found it. I bypassed the main floor and descended the wooden stairs into my basement workbench to begin the decryption process. I plugged the cloned drive into my air-gapped terminal. I launched a brute force decryption protocol I had retained from my senior auditing days. The software hammered against Diana's security firewall. I cross-referenced the alphanumeric codes I had memorized from the black ledger inside the wall safe with her hidden email directories. The firewall shattered. A concealed folder labeled Vanguard Transition populated on my monitor. I opened a lengthy chain of encrypted messages. The participants were Diana, my son Cameron, and his wife Monica. I opened the first email from Cameron. It detailed a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. His technology logistics firm was missing exactly $12 million in venture capital. The funds had not been lost in bad investments. They had been deliberately siphoned out. I opened the reply from Monica. She explicitly outlined the solution to their impending federal audit. She suggested using my spotless, 30-year auditing credentials to frame me for the massive embezzlement. She detailed how they could plant fabricated financial transfers on my personal computer to make me look like the mastermind. I opened the final message sent by Diana just 3 days ago. She confirmed the $15 million life insurance policy was fully active, with the double indemnity accidental death clause firmly in place. She instructed Cameron to prepare the offshore accounts, utilizing the routing numbers from the Black Ledger. Their plan was a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. They intended to frame me for the stolen $12 million murder me in a staged accident to trigger the massive insurance payout and use the 5 forged passports to vanish across international borders before the authorities could even launch an investigation. I stared at the glowing blue light of the monitor in the freezing basement. My son was not a victim of a failing business. He was the primary architect of my execution. The email stated they needed my physical signature on a set of fabricated consulting documents to solidify the frame job. They planned to confront me with the paperwork by tomorrow afternoon. I had less than 18 hours to dismantle a conspiracy engineered by the people I loved most. The sky over the Chicago suburbs was the color of bruised iron when I quietly disengaged the digital deadbolt on my front door. I had programmed the security system myself, meaning I knew exactly how to bypass the localized alert protocols without triggering a notification on Diana's phone. She was still asleep in the master bedroom, her breathing slow and rhythmic. I walked past the foot of the stairs, gripping the keys to my sedan. My alibi was already established. I had deliberately left the paint trays empty and the rollers unwashed in her office of solace, creating the perfect excuse for an early morning supply run to the local hardware store. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle, checked the rearview mirror out of sheer instinct, and pulled out of the driveway. I did not drive toward the commercial district. I headed south toward the industrial corridor bordering the city limits. The rendezvous point was a dilapidated auto repair garage tucked between a defunct textile mill and a rusting train yard. I pulled my sedan into the dark service bay just as the heavy corrugated metal door rolled down behind me, sealing off the outside world. The air inside smelled sharply of motor oil, ozone, and cold concrete. 2 men were waiting for me beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the back office. Fletcher stood near a grease-stained workbench, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate tailored suit. He was a corporate defense attorney who specialized in hostile takeovers and white-collar criminal litigation. We had crossed paths 10 years ago when my auditing team dismantled a fraudulent tech merger he was defending. He respected absolute precision, which was exactly why I retained him. Beside him sat Griffin, bathed in the blue glow of 3 linked tactical monitors. Griffin and I shared a history that predated my accounting career, stretching back to a signals intelligence unit deployed during the late 80s. He possessed a terrifying ability to extract digital secrets from the most secure mainframes on the planet. I walked over to the makeshift workstation and placed the cloned USB drive onto the metal table. Griffin did not offer a greeting. He simply snatched the drive, inserted it into his primary terminal, and initiated a sequence of localized decryption algorithms. Fletcher picked up the high-resolution photographs I had printed of the $15 million life insurance policy. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal boilerplate with predatory speed. Fletcher spoke first, his voice sharp and devoid of sympathy. "The documentation is pristine, Vincent. The underwriter is a top-tier financial institution. Diana utilized an executive loophole that bypasses standard medical examinations for high-net-worth corporate spouses. She forged your signature perfectly and completely bypassed the mandatory waiting period by paying the first premium entirely in cash. The double indemnity clause for accidental death is fully activated. Legally speaking, your life currently holds a $30 million bounty payable directly to a series of untraceable routing numbers." I absorbed the information without flinching. My focus shifted to Griffin, whose fingers were flying across his illuminated keyboard. Lines of dense code cascaded across the screens as he peeled back the layers of my son's digital infrastructure. Cameron's technology logistics firm was supposed to be a revolutionary venture. Instead, the financial architecture Griffin was exposing looked like a perfectly orchestrated demolition. Griffin stopped typing and pointed a calloused finger at a complex web of offshore banking nodes displayed on the central monitor. Your son did not simply lose $12 million in venture capital due to poor management, Vincent. This is a deliberate, highly sophisticated asset stripping operation. Griffin tapped a key highlighting a specific corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands. He explained that Cameron had systematically funneled the entire operational budget out of his primary company through a series of fabricated vendor invoices. Every single phantom invoice was routed directly into this offshore shell corporation. I leaned closer to the screen analyzing the routing data. My auditing instincts took over, tracing the flow of the stolen capital. Who holds the primary signatory rights on the Cayman account? I asked, anticipating the answer before Griffin even confirmed it. Griffin pulled up the encrypted registry documents. Monica, your daughter-in-law is the sole beneficiary and controlling director of the offshore holding company. She engineered the phantom vendor network. Cameron authorized the payouts. They bled the tech firm completely dry, transferring the stolen $12 million into an untouchable overseas vault. Fletcher slapped the insurance policy down on the workbench. It is a classic corporate bleed-out, but they have a massive liability. The federal auditors are going to tear Cameron's firm apart. When they discover the missing capital, they will track the vendor invoices. Cameron will face 30 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. The entire architecture of their conspiracy suddenly crystallized in my mind with horrifying clarity. They did not just need the $30 million life insurance payout to fund their escape. They needed a scapegoat to take the fall for the missing $12 million. They needed to plant the fabricated financial transfers onto my personal computer, linking me to the phantom vendors. They needed the authorities to believe a disgraced, retired logistics auditor had embezzled the funds to feed a secret gambling addiction or a hidden vice. Then they needed me to die in a tragic, unforeseen accident before the federal investigators could interrogate me. My corpse would close the investigation, trigger the insurance payout, and grant them absolute freedom using the 5 forged passports currently sitting in my wife's wall safe. A suffocating silence filled the garage. I was staring at the digital footprint of my own son plotting my execution. There was no room for parental grief. Grief implies a loss of something valuable. Cameron had voided our relationship the moment he priced my life against his stolen millions. I looked at Fletcher and asked him what our immediate legal countermeasures were. Fletcher shook his head firmly. We cannot move legally yet. If I file an injunction to freeze the policy, Diana will instantly realize you know about the trap. They will destroy the hard drives, burn the forged documents, and vanish using the passports before the FBI can build a cohesive case. To lock them away permanently, we need them to execute the final stage of their plan on tape. We need irrefutable proof of intent. Before I could formulate a response, Griffin raised his hand, signaling for absolute silence. A specialized decryption program running on his tertiary monitor began emitting a high-pitched chime. Griffin had successfully mirrored Monica's mobile device using the network data extracted from Diana's cloned drive. A live text message thread populated on the screen. Griffin read the intercepted text aloud, his tone grave. This just came through from Monica to Diana's personal device. The message stated that the external corporate auditors had unexpectedly moved up their timeline. The financial review boards were scheduled to arrive at Cameron's headquarters by Thursday morning. The text concluded with a terrifying mandate. We need the old man's physical signature on the consulting documents today, or Cameron goes to federal prison. Get it done before dinner. I stared at the glowing text on the monitor. The timeline had just collapsed. I did not have the luxury of careful, prolonged strategic maneuvering. My family was backed into a corner, completely terrified of the impending federal audit. Desperation breeds fatal mistakes, but it also accelerates violence. I had less than 24 hours before they forced my hand, extracted my signature, and triggered the lethal phase of their operation. I buttoned my jacket, thanked Fletcher and Griffin for the intelligence, and turned toward the garage exit. I had to go back to the house. I had to walk directly into the jaws of the trap, armed with nothing but the element of surprise and a lifetime of calculated restraint. The drive back from the industrial garage was a blur of gray concrete and impending dread. I pulled into our driveway, noticing my son's luxury German sedan parked haphazardly behind Diana's car. The engine block was still ticking, radiating heat. They were eager. I gripped the steering wheel, grounding myself in the present. My military intelligence background had trained me to compartmentalize fear, to lock it inside a mental vault, and throw away the combination. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the front door, projecting the weary shuffle of a retired auditor who had spent too long picking out the right shade of eggshell paint. The living room was a carefully staged tableau of domestic anxiety. Cameron paced the Persian rug, his tie loosened a sheen of manufactured sweat on his forehead. Monica sat perched on the edge of the leather armchair, clutching a ceramic mug with both hands, playing the role of the supportive, stressed wife perfectly. Diana stood by the fireplace, her face a mask of maternal concern. The coordination was seamless. Had I not seen the offshore routing numbers and the encrypted emails just hours earlier, I would have believed every second of their performance. Cameron rushed forward the moment I crossed the threshold. He threw his arms around me in a crushing embrace. It was the first time my son had hugged me spontaneously in over 5 years. The physical contact felt like a hollow, theatrical gesture. He pulled back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and launched into his script. He told a frantic, disjointed story about a sudden federal compliance audit hitting his technology logistics firm. He claimed his accounting department had misplaced critical oversight documentation, and the auditors were threatening to freeze his entire operational budget by morning. Monica chimed in on cue, her voice trembling, adding that they could lose the house, the business. Everything they had built if they did not provide a secondary verification signature from an accredited external consultant. It was a beautiful, desperate lie. Cameron reached into his Italian leather briefcase and produced a thick stack of stapled documents. He thrust them toward me, his eyes pleading. He needed my signature. He needed his retired father to vouch for his chaotic ledgers just this once to save his livelihood. I carried the documents to the heavy oak dining table and put on my reading glasses. I asked Diana for a glass of water, a calculated move to break their visual focus while I scanned the pages. The paperwork was dense, buried under layers of complex legal jargon and corporate indemnity clauses. I did not need to read every line. 30 years of forensic accounting allowed me to spot the fatal anomalies instantly. Paragraph 4 on the second page contained a sweeping liability assumption. Clause 7 transferred sole fiduciary responsibility for external vendor payouts directly to the signing consultant. This was not a compliance form. It was a fully executed confession. By signing the dotted line, I was legally acknowledging that I had orchestrated the phantom offshore transfers. I was providing the exact paper trail the federal investigators would need to pin the missing $12 million entirely on me. I looked up over the rim of my glasses. Cameron was holding his breath. The sheer greed radiating from his posture was almost suffocating. He was watching his father willingly step onto the gallows. I let out a long, weary sigh, sliding the documents into alignment. I told Cameron that the paperwork looked incredibly complex, but if it meant saving his company, I would assume the risk. The relief that washed over his face was genuine. He reached into his jacket and offered me a sleek, metallic ballpoint pen. I waved it away with a gentle smile. I told him that an old auditor never signs binding contracts with borrowed ink. I reached into my own breast pocket and retrieved a heavy vintage fountain pen. I had received it as a retirement gift. Cameron knew the pen well. He had seen me use it to sign his college tuition checks. What he did not know was that the internal ink cartridge had been swapped by Griffin less than an hour ago in that freezing mechanic's garage. The cartridge was filled with a highly specialized thermal degrading chemical compound utilized in corporate espionage. Upon contact with the cellulose in standard printer paper, the ink appeared pitch black and permanent. However, exposure to ambient room temperature caused the chemical bonds to rapidly destabilize. Within 12 hours, every stroke, every loop, every drop of ink would evaporate completely, leaving the paper entirely blank. I unscrewed the cap of the fountain pen. The steel nib scratched softly against the thick paper. I signed my full legal name on the first page. I flipped to the second, initialing the margins exactly where Cameron had placed little yellow adhesive arrows. Monica leaned closer, her eyes tracking the movement of my hand with predatory intensity. I signed the liability waiver. I signed the fiduciary transfer. I executed my own fabricated death warrant with deliberate, practiced elegance. As I completed the final signature block, I handed the heavy stack of paper back to my son. Cameron snatched the documents with a speed that betrayed his desperation. He shoved them into his briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He thanked me profusely, his voice thick with fake emotion, promising to make this up to me. I simply smiled, playing the role of the devoted patriarch. I watched my son and his wife hurry out the front door carrying a briefcase full of dissolving lies. They believed they had secured the final piece of the puzzle. They believed the frame job was absolute. The front door clicked shut. The silence returned to the living room, heavy and absolute. Diana walked out of the kitchen carrying a small silver tray. A crystal glass of water rested beside a small white plastic cup. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. My daily medication schedule. Diana approached me with a gentle, loving smile, her footsteps completely silent on the hardwood floor. She handed me the water and the small cup. She reminded me that I needed to take my blood pressure prescription, chiding me softly for almost forgetting amidst all the family chaos. I looked down at the cup. Inside sat 2 oval capsules. For 5 years, my daily medication had consisted of a specific brand of calcium channel blockers. They were manufactured with a distinct chalky matte finish. The 2 capsules resting in the cup right now were identical in size and shape. But as the afternoon sunlight caught the plastic, I noticed the texture. The surface of these pills was smooth, bearing a faint, almost imperceptible pearlescent sheen. They were a slightly different shade of white. I did not react. I did not let my gaze linger on the capsules for a fraction of a second longer than a careless old man would. I kept my breathing steady and my facial muscles completely relaxed. Diana stood only inches away, her blue eyes tracking my every movement. She was waiting for me to swallow them. The air between us felt charged with lethal electricity. I knew what the life insurance policy demanded. A sudden catastrophic medical failure. The altered medication was the catalyst. They had secured the financial confession, and now they were triggering the execution. I smiled at my wife, a warm expression of complete unquestioning trust, as I reached out to take the poisoned well into my own hands. Diana extended her hand toward me, her palm flat and steady. Resting in the center of her perfectly manicured fingers were the 2 smooth, pearlescent capsules. The presentation was casual, wrapped in the comforting routine of a 35-year marriage. She stood merely inches away, the scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the absolute malice of her intent. Her eyes locked onto mine, projecting an expression of deep maternal concern. She gently reminded me of the doctor's strict orders regarding my elevated blood pressure, chiding me softly for letting the chaotic family visit distract me from my health. She was offering me salvation while orchestrating my execution. I returned her warm smile, projecting the image of a grateful, slightly absent-minded husband. I reached out and pinched the capsules between my thumb and index finger. Decades ago, long before I settled into the predictable rhythm of corporate auditing, the military had trained me in the art of misdirection and sleight of hand. The muscle memory had never faded. In one fluid, uninterrupted motion, I rolled the poisoned capsules deep into the hidden crease of my palm. Simultaneously, my middle finger flicked a pair of benign, chalky mint placebos from my inner cuff directly onto my tongue. I brought the crystal glass of water to my lips and swallowed audibly, tilting my head back to complete the performance. Diana exhaled a soft, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. It was the sound of a predator watching the steel jaws of a trap snap shut. She leaned forward, kissed my cheek with cold lips, and retreated to the kitchen, entirely satisfied that the countdown had begun. I waited exactly 20 minutes before making my move. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed my heavy wool coat, and casually announced that the stress of Cameron's visit had given me a sudden craving for a dark roast coffee from the all-night diner across town. Diana barely looked up from her tablet, waving me off with a dismissive hand. The night air was biting as I stepped out into the driveway, the harsh wind whipping against the windshield of my sedan. I backed out slowly, maintaining the illusion of a leisurely evening drive until I crossed the neighborhood limits. Once I hit the main arterial road, my demeanor shifted entirely. The weary, compliant husband evaporated, replaced by the clinical detachment of a man fighting an active war. I bypassed the diner entirely, taking a convoluted, evasive route through abandoned commercial zones and industrial parks to ensure I was not being tracked. I pulled up to Griffin's secondary operational hub, an unmarked, fortified concrete storage unit tucked beneath a derelict highway overpass. Griffin opened the heavy steel door before I even knocked, his face illuminated by the harsh glare of overhead fluorescent lighting. The interior of the unit was outfitted like a clandestine military laboratory, packed with diagnostic machinery and secured servers. I walked directly to the stainless steel examination table and deposited the 2 pearlescent capsules onto a sterile glass tray. Griffin did not ask questions. He pulled on a pair of heavy nitrile gloves and secured a jeweler's loop over his right eye. Using a surgical scalpel, he carefully sliced down the seam of the first capsule. A fine, densely packed white powder spilled onto the glass surface, entirely odorless and uniform in texture. Griffin gathered a microscopic sample of the compound and transferred it into the processing receptacle of a portable mass spectrometer. The machine hummed to life, initiating a rapid chemical breakdown to isolate the molecular weight and toxicological signature of the substance. The wait was agonizing. The mechanical whir of the spectrometer filled the sterile room, processing the data against thousands of known chemical agents. Finally, the primary monitor flared a bright warning red. A complex molecular diagram populated the screen, followed by a dense block of pharmacological data. Griffin stepped back from the monitor, his posture rigid. He turned to me, his voice devoid of any inflection. The capsules did not contain a lethal dose of rat poison or heavy metals. Diana had acquired a highly synthesized, heavily restricted neurotoxin sourced exclusively from the dark web. Griffin explained the brutal mechanics of the compound. Once ingested, the toxin bypassed the liver and bound directly to the electrical receptors of the cardiac muscle. It was designed to mimic the exact physiological symptoms of a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. A single dose would cause lethargy and mild chest pain. Repeated doses over a strict 48-hour window would induce total cardiac paralysis. The most terrifying aspect of the compound was its degradation rate. Within 12 hours of the fatal heart attack, the chemical completely dissolved into the bloodstream, leaving zero trace evidence for a medical examiner to find during a standard autopsy. Diana was not just murdering me. She was subjecting me to a slow, agonizing systemic failure that would look completely natural to the authorities. The revelation did not ignite a blinding, reckless rage. It forged a state of absolute surgical clarity in my mind. Confrontation is a tactical error when dealing with cornered, desperate conspirators. I did not drive back home to scream or demand an explanation. I moved methodically to the secondary computer terminal resting on Griffin's desk. I withdrew the encrypted USB drive containing the cloned contents of Diana's laptop and the digitized alphanumeric codes from the Black Ledger. I inserted the drive into the secure terminal and initiated the bypass protocols. The monitors flickered, granting me unrestricted access to the dark financial architecture Monica had meticulously built in the Caribbean. I navigated through 3 separate layers of zero-knowledge authentication, utilizing the exact keystroke sequences I had memorized from the wall safe. The digital gateway to the Cayman Islands shell company shattered open. The central banking dashboard loaded onto the screen, displaying a pristine, verified balance of exactly $12 million. This was Cameron's stolen capital. This was the blood money they had siphoned from his failing logistics firm. This was the exact sum they intended to frame me for the financial motive they had fabricated to justify my impending death. I stared at the glowing digits, understanding that this money represented their entire future, their safety net, and their ultimate motive. I initiated a direct high-priority wire transfer protocol. I did not route the stolen millions into my own accounts. I did not send them to an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet or a secondary offshore holding firm. I opened a direct, heavily monitored routing portal belonging exclusively to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Financial Crimes Division. I prepared the transfer data, aiming the entire $12 million sum directly at the federal asset forfeiture account. To execute the transaction, I needed a verified digital signature. I opened the cloned email threads and extracted Cameron's specific IP address, his primary network identifiers, and the digital footprint of his personal laptop. I spoofed the origin connection on Griffin's terminal, wrapping the massive wire transfer request entirely in Cameron's unique digital identity. When the federal investigators analyzed the transaction, the data would tell a very specific story. It would appear as though my son, terrified by the impending corporate audit and drowning in guilt, had panicked and desperately wired the embezzled funds directly into a government holding account in an act of sudden surrender. I locked the routing numbers into the interface. I hovered my finger over the execution key, feeling the absolute weight of the moment. I pressed down. The progress bar flashed across the screen, turning a solid, undeniable green. The $12 million vanished instantly into the impenetrable federal ether. The Cayman account balance dropped to absolute zero. The financial guillotine had fallen. I stood up from the terminal, leaving my family with absolutely no money, an impending federal investigation, and an execution plot that was about to fail spectacularly. The silent adjustment was now in motion. I returned to the house just as the evening shadows began to stretch across the manicured lawn. The air inside the foyer was perfectly still. I hung my heavy wool coat in the hall closet and walked into the living room, projecting the slow, steady gait of an exhausted old man. I settled deep into the worn leather of my favorite reading chair. The fireplace was cold, but the room felt suffocatingly warm. I picked up a thick hardcover biography from the side table and opened it to a random page. I was not reading a single word. I was simply waiting. The digital payload I had launched from the fortified terminal at Griffin's garage was currently obliterating my son's future. I knew it would not be long before the shockwave hit my house. I breathed in the scent of lemon furniture polish and turned a page with slow, deliberate care. I was the picture of a harmless retired accountant winding down for the night. From the kitchen island 30 feet away, Diana's cellular phone began to vibrate against the marble countertop. It buzzed with a sharp, persistent rhythm that shattered the quiet illusion of our home. Diana walked quickly into the kitchen from the hallway, wiping her hands on a linen towel. She picked up the device and answered with her usual polished grace. The elegant facade evaporated in less than 3 seconds. Even from my armchair, I could hear the frantic, high-pitched wail bleeding through the small speaker of her phone. It was Monica. My daughter-in-law was not crying. She was screaming with the primal terror of a trapped animal. The pitch of her voice carried clearly through the open layout of the house. I turned another page of my book, keeping my eyes locked on the text. Diana gripped the edge of the marble island with her free hand. Her knuckles turned bone white. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent gray. She whispered a harsh command into the receiver, demanding that Monica calm down and explain exactly what had happened. I listened intently, catching the fragmented shards of panic pouring out of the phone. Monica was hyperventilating. She shrieked that the Cayman account was gone. The offshore holding company was completely empty. The $12 million they had bled from the technology logistics firm had vanished into thin air. There was no trace of a transfer, no pending status, just a flat zero balance. Their entire escape fund had been vaporized. Diana dropped the linen towel onto the floor. Her hands shook violently as she ended the call without saying another word. She leaned heavily against the counter, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the room. The carefully constructed criminal empire she had built was collapsing around her in real time. She had spent months coordinating the embezzlement, securing the forged passports, and orchestrating my execution. Now she was standing in a pristine suburban kitchen facing total ruin. I kept my breathing slow and steady. I did not ask her if everything was all right. I let her drown in the silence. Diana turned her back to me and immediately dialed another number. She pressed the phone tightly to her ear, pacing the length of the kitchen with frantic, erratic steps. When Cameron answered, her voice was a vicious, terrified hiss. She demanded to know what he had done. She asked if the federal auditors had moved early and frozen the offshore assets. I could not hear Cameron's response, but Diana's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Cameron had no idea what was happening. He was likely staring at the same blank screens Monica had seen, paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his stolen wealth. Diana paced faster, her voice dropping an octave as absolute desperation seized her throat. She told Cameron that they had no time left to figure out the glitch. She stated clearly that without the stolen $12 million, they could not flee the country. They could not pay the fixers who helped them set up the corporate shell accounts. They had zero leverage and zero cash. The federal investigation would tear through Cameron's company by Thursday, and they would all be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I turned another page of my book. The rustle of the paper sounded loud in the tense atmosphere. Diana stopped pacing abruptly. I could feel her gaze shift toward the living room, locking onto the back of my chair. I knew exactly what she was calculating in that moment. The slow-acting neurotoxin she believed she had fed me earlier was designed to take 48 hours to trigger a fatal cardiac event. That timeline was a luxury they could no longer afford. They were broke and terrified. They needed capital immediately. They needed the $15 million life insurance payout and the $30 million double indemnity bonus right now. They could not wait 2 days for a subtle medical failure. They needed a catastrophic, undeniable accident. They needed a body before the sun came up tomorrow. Diana ended the call with Cameron. I heard her taking deep, shuddering breaths, trying to force her shattered nervous system back under control. I waited. A minute passed. Then another. When she finally walked into the living room, her physical transformation was chilling. The sheer panic had been buried under a thick layer of desperate affection. She approached my armchair, moving with slow, deliberate steps. I looked up from my biography, offering her a mild, questioning smile. She knelt beside my chair, resting her hands gently on my knee. Her skin was ice cold. Her eyes were wide and filled with a manufactured vulnerability. She forced her lips into a sweet, trembling smile. She told me that the house felt incredibly stressful lately. She said that Cameron's business troubles were taking a toll on her nerves, and she just needed to escape the city. Her voice quivered, hitting the exact frequency of a devoted wife asking her husband for comfort. She stroked my hand and suggested a spontaneous romantic getaway. She told me Cameron had offered us the use of his private hunting cabin up by the lake for the weekend. She painted a picture of quiet evenings by the fire, isolated from the world and all its problems. I knew the property she was talking about. The cabin was located 3 hours north, entirely off the grid, surrounded by dense forest and treacherous mountain roads. It had no cellular reception and no close neighbors. It was a completely blind spot on the map. I looked into her icy blue eyes. I saw the absolute void behind her smile. She was not inviting me on a vacation. She was luring me to a designated kill box. The secluded cabin was the perfect environment for a tragic accident. A fatal fall down a steep ravine, a slip into the freezing lake, a tragic mishap with a hunting rifle. They needed my death to be violent, immediate, and highly profitable. I did not pull my hand away. I did not let the cold fury rising in my chest alter my expression. I reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, playing the role of the protective patriarch perfectly. I told her that a weekend away sounded exactly like what we both needed. I agreed that the city was suffocating and the fresh mountain air would do wonders for our health. I smiled warmly and told her I would go upstairs and pack my suitcase immediately so we could leave tonight. Diana exhaled deeply, kissing my knuckles with poisoned lips. She believed she was leading a lamb to the slaughter. She had no idea she was locking herself inside a cage with a predator. The asphalt transitioned to jagged gravel as we drove deeper into the dense timberline. The headlights of the sedan carved narrow tunnels through the absolute darkness of the mountain road. Diana held the steering wheel with a rigid grip. Her knuckles were stark white in the dim glow of the dashboard. She filled the suffocating silence of the cabin with an endless stream of nervous chatter. She spoke rapidly about the benefits of alpine air, about how the stress of the week would melt away beside a roaring fire, about how we needed this time to reconnect. It was a chaotic symphony of manufactured optimism. I leaned my head against the cold passenger window, keeping my eyes half closed. I let my breathing drop to a slow, rhythmic wheeze, projecting the image of a frail, exhausted man succumbing to age. Every muscle in my body was coiled tightly, calculating the variables of the impending ambush. Diana took the hairpin turns far too aggressively. Her foot stomped the accelerator with erratic bursts of speed. She was not a wife driving her husband to a romantic getaway. She was a courier delivering a high-value target to an execution site. She wanted the transit phase over. We crested the final ridge and the desolate property came into view. The cabin sat isolated on the edge of a massive frozen lake. There were no neighboring structures, no streetlights, no cellular towers. It was a geographical dead zone. Diana cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp howling of the wind through the pines. She hurried out of the vehicle, retrieving her leather overnight bag from the trunk. I unbuckled my seatbelt with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I opened the heavy car door and stepped out into the biting cold, forcing a slight tremor into my hands. My eyes immediately swept the perimeter of the property. The driveway was empty, suggesting we were entirely alone. However, the military had trained me to look past the obvious canvas. I scanned the thickest cluster of evergreens 40 yards to the east. The moonlight caught a faint, unnatural reflection deep within the brush. It was the chrome grille of a heavy luxury SUV. Cameron had arrived hours ago. He had intentionally parked his vehicle off the gravel path, concealing it behind the heavy foliage to maintain the illusion of a spontaneous, secluded retreat. I filed the tactical error away and shuffled toward the wooden porch steps. Diana pushed open the heavy oak door. A blast of dry, heated air hit my face. The interior of the cabin was bathed in the warm, flickering orange light of a massive stone fireplace. I stepped over the threshold, leaning heavily on the doorframe. Footsteps echoed from the shadowy corridor leading to the kitchen. Cameron and Monica emerged into the firelight. They did not look like a couple seeking refuge in the wilderness. Monica wore a tailored cashmere sweater and expensive suede designer heels, an outfit entirely unsuited for a rustic mountain environment. Cameron projected a wide, blindingly fake smile. He rushed forward, throwing his hands up in a gesture of pleasant surprise. He announced that he and Monica had decided to drive up early to prepare the cabin for us, claiming they wanted to properly celebrate the successful resolution of his corporate audit. It was a flimsy, poorly constructed narrative designed to mask their ambush. Diana feigned absolute shock, hugging her son and daughter-in-law with theatrical enthusiasm. I offered a tired, compliant smile, shuffling slowly toward the center of the living room. Cameron moved swiftly to a polished wooden bar cart positioned near the hearth. A heavy crystal decanter filled with dark amber liquid rested next to a set of heavy tumblers. He spoke rapidly about acquiring a rare aged Scotch specifically for this occasion. He poured 3 precise measures into the glasses, then retrieved a 4th tumbler from the back of the cart. He filled it and turned toward me, extending his arm. The firelight danced through the liquid. I knew exactly what was suspended within that specific glass. It was the final, concentrated dose of the dark web neurotoxin, the chemical catalyst required to induce a massive, untraceable cardiac arrest. The dosage was engineered to trigger the total physiological collapse they needed to claim the $30 million double indemnity life insurance payout before the federal investigators breached Cameron's empty offshore accounts tomorrow morning. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold crystal. The room plunged into a suffocating stillness. Diana Cameron and Monica stopped moving entirely. Their eyes locked onto the glass in my hand. They were holding their breath, waiting for the final mechanism of their trap to snap shut. They expected me to raise the glass to my lips. They expected me to swallow the poison blindly, just as I had swallowed the manipulated medication earlier that afternoon. I did not reach into my pocket to execute a sleight of hand. I did not attempt to swap the vessel. I looked directly into Monica's cold, expectant eyes. I brought the heavy tumbler up toward my chest. Then I initiated a violent full-body tremor. My right arm jerked forward with brutal, calculated force. The crystal glass slipped from my grip and shattered violently against the stone floor. The entire contents of the poisoned scotch splashed outward in a wide arc, soaking directly into Monica's expensive suede heels. She shrieked in absolute disgust, jumping backward as the dark liquid stained her shoes. I did not give them a single second to process the spilled drink. Before Cameron could voice a protest, I let my eyes roll back into my skull. I dropped my jaw, emitting a harsh, ragged gasp that rattled deep in my throat. I forced my knees to buckle simultaneously, twisting my torso to the left. I collapsed heavily onto the rough woven rug, ensuring my shoulder absorbed the brunt of the impact. I allowed my limbs to splay out at unnatural angles, perfectly simulating the catastrophic motor failure of a massive neurological event. My cheek pressed against the cold floorboards. I ceased all voluntary movement, locking my muscles into a rigid, paralyzed state. I stared blankly at the baseboards, my breathing shallow and erratic, waiting for the monsters in the room to drop their masks. The rough woven rug fibers scratched against my right cheek as I forced my eyelids to remain locked open, staring blankly at the dust particles dancing in the firelight near the baseboards. Military survival training dictated that simulating paralysis required overriding every natural instinct of the human nervous system. I slowed my breathing to a ragged, uneven wheeze, drawing just enough oxygen to maintain consciousness, while projecting the absolute failure of my respiratory system. The shattered crystal from the tumbler lay inches from my nose. The sharp, peaty scent of the expensive scotch saturated the air pooling around Monica and her suede heels. For 10 agonizing seconds, the cabin was absolutely still. The crackle of the burning pine logs in the hearth was the only sound breaking the vacuum. I waited for the panicked screams, the rush for a telephone, the desperate attempts at cardiopulmonary resuscitation. None of it came. Instead, the heavy silence stretched, thick with lethal anticipation. A sharp sigh of profound annoyance broke the quiet. Monica stepped back from the expanding puddle of liquor. She complained about the ruined suede, her tone entirely devoid of shock or grief. She kicked the stained designer shoes off her feet, leaving them near my motionless hand. She muttered that the timing was incredibly inconvenient, but at least the primary objective was finally in motion. Diana walked into my field of vision. Her expensive leather boots stopped just short of the spilled scotch. She did not crouch down to check my pulse or reach out to cradle my head. She simply nudged my shoulder with the toe of her boot, testing the rigidity of my muscles. Her voice shifted, shedding the sweet, trembling affection she had weaponized for 35 years. She spoke with the clinical, detached efficiency of a project manager reviewing a completed task. She noted that the neurotoxin had taken slightly longer than the dark web vendor had promised, but the physiological response was exactly as advertised. She commended Cameron for ensuring I consumed the entire dosage over the past 2 days. Cameron stepped into view, his leather briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He stared down at me, his chest heaving with residual adrenaline. He asked his mother if they should call the local emergency services now, to establish the timeline of the tragic accident. Diana immediately vetoed the suggestion. She instructed him to wait until my breathing stopped completely. Medical intervention, even in a remote location, introduced unnecessary variables. They needed a corpse, not a patient in critical condition. Cameron nodded, accepting the logic without a trace of filial hesitation. He knelt beside my waist, the brass clasps of his briefcase clicking sharply as he opened it. He reached inside and withdrew the stack of consulting documents I had signed just an hour earlier. He explained the exact logistics of the frame job to Monica and Diana. He folded the documents neatly, detailing how he would slide them into the interior breast pocket of my wool coat. When the coroner and the police arrived, they would find the absolute proof of my guilt, securely fastened to my body. He stated that the federal auditors would discover the paperwork during the asset freeze tomorrow morning. The authorities would see a disgraced retired accountant who had embezzled $12 million buckled under the crushing weight of impending federal prosecution and suffered a massive fatal stroke from the sheer stress of his crimes. The narrative was hermetically sealed. Diana stepped away from my body, pacing the length of the woven rug to outline her immediate exit strategy. She told Cameron that the moment the police cleared the scene and the coroner issued the preliminary death certificate, she was driving straight to the international terminal. She explicitly named the Canadian alias printed on the first forged passport I had discovered in her wall safe. She detailed her flight itinerary to Montreal, followed by a connecting red-eye flight to a non-extradition territory in South America. She instructed Monica to initiate the offshore transfers the second the life insurance conglomerate approved the $30 million payout. She spoke of the hidden Cayman accounts with absolute certainty, completely unaware that I had reduced her illicit empire to zero. I kept my gaze fixed on the baseboards, focusing on the microscopic details of the wood grain to suppress the urge to blink. Every muscle in my legs screamed with lactic acid buildup demanding movement, but I remained locked in stone. I listened to my family dissect my life, carve up my assets, and plan their luxurious futures over my dying breaths. There was no hesitation, no moral conflict, no lingering affection. I was simply an expired asset, a logistical hurdle that had finally been cleared. Monica walked over to the leather sofa. I heard the soft rustle of fabric as she picked up a heavy decorative throw pillow. She walked back to the center of the room, standing directly above my head. She looked down at me, her expression a mask of cold, sociopathic impatience. She pointed out that my chest was still rising and falling. The neurotoxin was causing a total systemic shutdown, but my heart was stubbornly refusing to stop. She reminded Cameron that the federal auditors were arriving at his headquarters in exactly 14 hours. They could not afford to sit in this freezing cabin all night waiting for my biology to surrender. The timeline was too tight. The risk of the police delaying the insurance payout due to a prolonged investigation was too high. They needed to accelerate the expiration process. She handed the heavy pillow to Cameron. She told him to press it over my face and hold it there until the struggling stopped. She reasoned that the neurotoxin had already paralyzed my motor functions, meaning I could not fight back. There would be no defensive wounds, no bruising, no signs of a struggle. The medical examiner would attribute the asphyxiation to the catastrophic heart failure. It was the perfect, invisible murder. I felt a cold bead of sweat slide down my temple. I was not afraid of the pillow. I was focused entirely on the small military-grade subcutaneous transmitter taped securely against the lower ridge of my left ribcage. The wire was currently broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition audio feed across an encrypted frequency. Exactly 3 miles down the desolate mountain road, parked in absolute darkness, Griffin and Fletcher were sitting in the back of a heavily armored surveillance van. They were monitoring the live transmission, recording every single syllable of this lethal conspiracy. They possessed the definitive, irrefutable proof of premeditated murder, wire fraud, and insurance manipulation. The audio file was being simultaneously backed up to multiple secure federal servers. Cameron stood frozen, holding the decorative pillow. He looked down at my face, a brief flash of cowardly hesitation crossing his features. He had been comfortable orchestrating the embezzlement from behind a computer screen. He had been comfortable letting his mother poison my medication. But crossing the final threshold, committing the physical act of murder with his own hands, required a level of brutality he had not yet accessed. Diana stepped forward, placing a firm, encouraging hand on his shoulder. She whispered that this was the only way to save the family. She told him to be a man, to protect his wife, to secure their future. The hesitation vanished from my son's eyes. He dropped to his knees, positioning himself directly beside my head. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the spilled scotch on the floor. He raised the pillow, his shadow falling across my face, eclipsing the warm light of the fireplace. He leaned his weight forward, bringing the heavy fabric down toward my nose and mouth. The trap was fully sprung, and the final adjustment was ready to commence. The heavy fabric of the decorative throw pillow descended toward my face, blotting out the ambient orange glow of the hearth. I could smell the faint trace of lavender detergent woven into the linen, a domestic scent starkly contrasting the murderous intent driving it downward. Cameron shifted his weight, committing the entirety of his upper body to the downward thrust. He expected to encounter the weak, uncoordinated thrashing of a dying man yielding to a pharmaceutically induced cardiac arrest. He anticipated the muffled gasps of a failing respiratory system and the final pathetic spasms of a father he despised. He was entirely unprepared for the violent kinetic reality of a fully aware, highly trained intelligence operative. Before the linen could graze the bridge of my nose, my eyes snapped open. The sudden, unblinking focus paralyzed him for a fraction of a second. His pupils dilated in sheer, unadulterated shock. That microsecond of hesitation was all the tactical advantage I required. My right hand shot upward, bypassing the descending pillow entirely. I clamped my fingers around his left wrist, locking my grip with absolute bone-crushing leverage. Cameron gasped a sharp intake of breath that betrayed his profound cognitive failure to process the moment. I did not give his brain time to catch up to the impossible failure of his poison. I torqued my shoulder, driving the momentum upward, while simultaneously twisting his wrist sharply against the natural rotation of the joint. The mechanical strain on his tendons and ligaments was immediate and severe. A sickening pop echoed clearly over the crackle of the fireplace. Cameron shrieked. It was a high, reedy sound, entirely devoid of the smug, corporate confidence he had projected mere minutes earlier. The agonizing pain forced his fingers to splay open involuntarily. The heavy throw pillow tumbled from his grasp, landing softly on the woven rug beside my head, entirely useless. I maintained the punishing lock on his wrist, utilizing his off-balance, panicked posture to haul myself upward in one fluid, unbroken motion. I pushed him backward with a calculated, forceful strike to his sternum. He stumbled over his own expensive footwear and crashed violently into the heavy wooden coffee table, clutching his injured arm tightly against his chest, whining in pain. I stood up to my full height, feeling the satisfying, rigid alignment of my spine. The feigned weakness, the manufactured tremors, the labored, wheezing breathing, I discarded them all, instantly shedding the persona of the frail, compliant victim like a cheap theatrical costume. I reached down and calmly dusted a few stray specks of lint from the knees of my trousers. I adjusted the cuffs of my shirt with deliberate, agonizing slowness, letting the heavy silence stretch and amplify the absolute terror radiating from the three conspirators. The sheer, undeniable impossibility of my resurrection pinned them to the floorboards. Monica had pressed both her trembling hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking, taking shallow, frantic breaths as if the air in the cabin had suddenly turned to ash. Diana retreated slowly, her leather boots sliding backward inch by inch until her spine hit the rough timber of the cabin wall. She stared at me as if a reanimated corpse had just crawled out of a shallow grave. The predator she believed she was had just realized with crushing certainty that she was locked inside a cage with something far more dangerous. I looked directly at my wife. The warmth, the decades of practiced familial devotion, the gentle indulgence I had provided for 35 years had been entirely excised from my expression. When I spoke, my voice was a flat, terrifying baritone devoid of any emotional fluctuation or merciful inflection. It was the voice of an operative delivering an after-action report on a neutralized threat. I told Diana that her dark web supplier had indeed provided a highly effective premium-grade neurotoxin. I complimented the malicious chemical engineering, noting how perfectly it was designed to mimic a catastrophic myocardial infarction while simultaneously dissolving tracelessly into the bloodstream to evade autopsy detection. Her face drained of all remaining color, leaving her skin a chalky, sickly white. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some desperate fabricated lie, but her vocal cords completely failed her. I explained that sleight of hand is a perishable skill, but thankfully, 3 decades of spotting corporate deceit had kept my situational awareness razor sharp. I detailed precisely how easily I had palmed her pearlescent capsules in our living room and swallowed benign, chalky mints in their place. I watched the devastating realization wash over her features. Every calculated move she had made, every cup of water she had offered, every false tear she had shed, had been a humiliating, transparent pantomime. I turned my attention away from my shattered wife and focused entirely on Monica. She shrank back against the armrest of the leather sofa, trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, taking command of the physical space, forcing them to track my movements like cornered, helpless prey. I shifted the operational debrief to their financial architecture, the true heart of their conspiracy. I told Monica that her Caribbean shell company was brilliantly structured and adequately shielded. The layered zero-knowledge authentication protocols she had deployed were genuinely impressive for a logistical amateur. However, storing the alphanumeric access codes in a cheap residential wall safe behind a framed painting was a fatal amateurish tactical error. I watched Monica stop breathing. The cognitive dissonance was fracturing her mind in real time. I explained exactly how I had cloned the hard drive of Diana's laptop while they were finalizing their murder plot in the freezing industrial garage. I recited the specific complex routing numbers of her Cayman Islands account aloud, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that I possessed total, unrestricted ownership of their digital empire. Cameron pushed himself off the splintered edge of the coffee table, his face contorted into a mask of pure, frantic, unadulterated rage. He was cradling his sprained wrist, sweating profusely, his chest heaving with desperate, panicked adrenaline. He refused to accept the totality of his defeat. He could not comprehend that the father he deemed obsolete had dismantled his entire life. I looked at him addressing the $12 million he had systematically embezzled from his own technology firm. I told him that stealing capital is a relatively simple matter of altering ledgers, but concealing it requires a level of operational discipline he simply did not possess. I informed my son that I had bypassed his offshore security gateway less than 3 hours ago from a secure terminal. I described the exact sequence of keystrokes I used to execute a high-priority, untraceable international wire transfer. I told them, enunciating every word with lethal clarity, that the Cayman account balance was currently sitting at absolute zero. I had not kept a single dime of their blood money. Instead, I had routed the entire $12 million sum directly into the asset forfeiture accounts of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, permanently attaching Cameron's unique network identifiers and personal IP address to the digital transit log. The gravity of that revelation hit the room with the force of a physical detonation. The psychological shockwave leveled them. They had no money. They had no escape fund. They had no leverage to buy their way out of the country. They were completely broke, trapped in a remote, freezing mountain cabin and actively bleeding a digital trail that would bring federal agents crashing through the glass doors of his technology firm by dawn. The brilliant, airtight conspiracy they had spent months refining had been inverted into a meticulously constructed, inescapable trap. They were no longer wealthy inheritors awaiting a tragic payout. They were staring down the barrel of decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Cameron snapped. The systematic, absolute destruction of his entire reality pushed him past the brink of rational thought. He let out a guttural, wet roar of defiance and lunged toward his expensive Italian leather jacket, draped over the back of the nearby armchair. He fumbled frantically with the interior breast pocket, using his uninjured hand tearing the fabric in his manic haste. He grabbed the thick stack of stapled legal documents and thrust them toward me, his hand shaking with violent, uncontrollable fury. He shouted that my digital sabotage did not matter in the real world. He screamed, spit flying from his lips, that he possessed my physical signature on the binding corporate indemnity clauses. He declared triumphantly that I had legally, undeniably assumed sole fiduciary responsibility for the phantom offshore transfers. He swore, his voice cracking with hysteria, that he would hand the paperwork directly to the federal auditors tomorrow morning and watch me rot in a penitentiary for the massive fraud he committed. His voice echoed off the heavy timber ceiling, a pathetic, desperate crescendo that died in the cold air. He held the paperwork aloft like a protective shield against his impending doom. He truly believed he retained a single definitive shred of leverage to destroy my life. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I did not move aggressively toward him. I simply stood in the center of the warm, fire-lit room, absorbing his hatred, and offered him a cold, pitying smile. I raised my right hand slowly and gestured toward the stapled stack of papers he was clutching so desperately. I calmly suggested, my tone barely above a whisper, that he open the document and personally verify the signature before making any more threats to federal authorities. Cameron glared at me, his chest heaving like a cornered animal. He yanked the heavy cover page back, his bloodshot eyes darting immediately to the bottom of the first sheet, where I had executed the contract hours earlier in our living room. He froze completely. His jaw went slack. He flipped frantically to the second page, then the third, tearing the stapled corners in his manic, terrified haste. He checked the margins where the yellow adhesive arrows were still firmly attached to the parchment. He rubbed his thumb aggressively across the thick cellulose paper, pressing his face close to the page, searching for an indentation, a smudge, a single microscopic drop of black ink. There was absolutely nothing. The highly specialized thermal-degrading chemical compound Griffin had loaded into my vintage fountain pen had performed its function flawlessly. Exposure to the ambient room temperature inside the house and the vehicle had rapidly destabilized the molecular bonds of the fluid. The heavy, deliberate strokes of my name, the careful initials in the margins, the sweeping liability waivers, all of it had evaporated completely into the air, leaving no chemical residue behind. Cameron was standing in a remote, freezing mountain cabin surrounded by a ruined conspiracy and impending federal charges, holding a fistful of entirely blank paper. Cameron stared at the blank paper. The silence in the cabin became a physical weight. Monica cracked first. The pristine facade she had maintained for years shattered into pure, primal instinct. She looked at the empty pages in her husband's trembling hands and realized the absolute totality of their failure. She did not scream. She did not argue. She simply turned and bolted. Her expensive suede heels discarded by the fireplace, she ran barefoot across the rough floorboards. She lunged toward the heavy oak front door, driven by the desperate illusion that she could somehow outrun a federal dragnet. Her hand grasped the wrought iron handle. She yanked it downward, throwing her entire body weight against the wood. The door did not open. It exploded inward. A tremendous kinetic force shattered the reinforced hinges, sending lethal splinters of oak raining across the entry mat. A matte black battering ram withdrew into the freezing darkness outside. Immediately, the cabin was flooded with blinding tactical strobe lights. The serene orange glow of the hearth was instantly overpowered by harsh, strobing white beams slicing through the room. Men clad in heavy olive-drab ballistic armor poured through the shattered threshold. They moved with terrifying surgical precision. The ambient silence was annihilated by the deafening commands of federal agents ordering everyone to the ground. Monica was thrown backward by the concussive force of the breach. She scrambled blindly against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. 3 distinct ruby-red laser sights materialized in the smoky air. The targeting dots painted the center of her cashmere sweater. A second cluster of lasers tracked perfectly across Diana's chest, locking onto her heart. A third set centered directly between Cameron's eyes. He dropped the blank documents, raising his uninjured hand in immediate, absolute surrender. The tactical operators did not hesitate. They swarmed the living space, neutralizing the targets with practiced, brutal efficiency. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Cameron by the shoulders, driving his face hard against the polished coffee table. They wrenched his arms behind his back, ignoring his agonizing cries as steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly over his sprained wrist. Another agent swept Diana off her feet, forcing her face down onto the woven rug, right beside the puddle of spilled scotch. She gasped for air as a heavy knee pressed into her spine, securing her hands behind her back. Monica surrendered immediately, dropping flat onto the floorboards, crying hysterically as cold steel snapped around her wrists. I remained standing perfectly still by the armchair, keeping my hands clearly visible at my sides. I recognized the operational signature. Griffin and Fletcher were sitting in the mobile command center, parked 3 miles down the mountain road, managing the tactical feed. They had transmitted our exact coordinates and the real-time audio feed directly to the field office. The perimeter was completely secured. Through the shattered doorway, a final figure stepped into the cabin. He wore a dark tailored suit layered beneath a standard-issue Kevlar vest, bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He bypassed the tactical operators holding down my family and walked directly to the center of the living room. His demeanor was entirely calm, a stark contrast to the violent kinetic energy of the raid. Song. The lead agent looked down at Cameron. He did not ask questions. He did not read him his rights immediately. He produced a thick manila folder from under his arm and dropped it directly in front of my son's face on the coffee table. The agent informed Cameron that he was the primary target of a massive multi-agency financial crimes task force. He detailed the specific charges, reciting them with bureaucratic lethality: wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance manipulation. Cameron choked on his own breath, trying to formulate a denial. The agent silenced him instantly. He kicked the folder open, revealing a stack of freshly printed documents. The top page displayed a highly classified digital network routing log. The agent explained that less than an hour ago, the Bureau received a massive unsolicited wire transfer of exactly $12 million. He leaned closer, ensuring Cameron saw the origin data printed on the ledger. The transfer had originated from Cameron's personal offshore shell company and was sent directly into a federal asset forfeiture holding account. The agent pointed to the bottom of the page, highlighting a long string of alphanumeric code. He informed my son that their cyber division had already verified the digital fingerprint of the transaction. The $12 million transfer was authorized, executed, and permanently stamped with Cameron's primary network identifiers and his specific home internet address. To the federal government, it appeared as though a guilty, terrified executive had panicked and desperately surrendered the stolen capital directly to the authorities. The perfect electronic frame job was complete. Cameron stared at the routing numbers, his mind collapsing under the sheer weight of the evidence. He realized he could never prove the transaction was spoofed. His own digital footprint had secured his conviction. Diana struggled against the weight of the agent pinning her to the rug. She twisted her neck, looking at the thick folder on the table. The reality of the vanished money and the federal raid finally broke through her arrogance. She understood that the financial motive for my murder had been neutralized, and the audio recordings had exposed her execution plot. She possessed only one remaining card to play. She decided to burn the entire ship down to save herself. She raised her head and screamed at the lead agent. Her voice was harsh and guttural, echoing off the wooden beams. She demanded that the agents look at me. She shrieked that I was the actual mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. She pointed her chin toward me, claiming that I had forced them into the embezzlement scheme to fund my own escape. She yelled that I was planning to fake my own death and flee the jurisdiction. She told the federal agent that if he wanted the real proof, he needed to search the primary residence in the suburbs immediately. She detailed the exact location of the hidden wall safe behind the landscape painting in my home office. She explicitly stated that the safe contained 2 forged Canadian passports, bearing fake aliases and entirely new identities that I had purchased from the dark web. She portrayed herself as a terrified hostage trying to stop a ruthless criminal from vanishing across the border. It was a brilliant, desperate improvisation designed to muddy the waters and introduce reasonable doubt into the federal narrative. The lead agent slowly turned his head to look at me. His expression was completely neutral, assessing the wild accusations. The tactical operators in the room shifted their posture slightly, waiting for a command. I did not break eye contact with my wife. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against the fabricated claims. I maintained the cold, absolute discipline of a man who had anticipated this exact countermeasure. I reached into my right trouser pocket, using slow, telegraphed movements to avoid startling the armed federal agents. I extracted a heavy brass key attached to a simple leather lanyard. It was the master key to the suburban house and the primary override for the biometric wall safe. I extended my arm, offering the brass key directly to the lead federal agent. I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity. I explicitly granted the Federal Bureau of Investigation total unencumbered consent to enter my primary residence. I gave them full authorization to open the hidden wall safe behind the painting and confiscate the forged passports inside. I watched Diana's eyes widen in pure confusion. She had expected me to panic, to deny the existence of the safe, to fight the search. Instead, I had willingly handed the federal authorities the exact tool they needed to open the vault. The trap was advancing to its final fatal stage. The federal agents swarming my suburban home at that exact moment were not finding a pair of forged Canadian passports or a ledger detailing my supposed crimes. I had anticipated Diana's desperate gambit hours before she even conceived it. While she had been nervously pacing the kitchen floor, screaming at Cameron over the phone, I had walked upstairs to her immaculate home office. I possessed the biometric bypass codes Griffin had procured during his initial digital sweep. The wall safe behind the landscape painting slid open with a quiet, mechanical click. I removed the leather-bound ledger and the 2 fraudulent passports she intended to use for her South American escape. I did not leave the steel vault empty. I replaced her escape materials with a heavy reinforced canvas bag Griffin had prepared specifically for this contingency. Inside the bag rested a comprehensive array of highly illegal professional-grade document forgery equipment. There were custom-engraved thermal stamping dies, stolen government watermarks, and synthetic passport paper. Every single item inside that bag was thoroughly coated in Diana's pristine fingerprints. Getting her prints had been a simple matter of asking her to hand me a series of polished glass paperweights from the high shelves while I was cleaning the study earlier that week. Griffin had masterfully lifted and transferred those prints directly onto the contraband. Beside the forgery tools, I placed a thick stack of freshly printed emails. These were the decrypted communications Griffin had intercepted, detailing Diana's transactions on the dark web. The pages documented her negotiating the purchase of the restricted cardiac neurotoxin, haggling over the price, and requesting expedited shipping to a secure Dropbox. The transaction receipts clearly displayed her personal banking details, routed through a cryptocurrency tumbler that Griffin had easily cracked. When the federal technicians breached that safe, they would find the absolute undeniable proof of her guilt, perfectly preserved and waiting for them. The narrative she had tried to construct in the cabin was currently collapsing into a massive federal indictment back in the city. Her attempt to frame me had simply provided the authorities with the exact coordinates of her own destruction. Cameron sat shivering inside a windowless concrete holding cell at the federal field office. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, casting sickly green shadows across his pale, sweating face. His designer cashmere sweater was torn at the collar, and his wrists were severely bruised from the tight steel handcuffs. The sheer terror of his new reality was slowly paralyzing his nervous system. He had spent his entire life insulated by corporate wealth and maternal protection. He was accustomed to solving problems with aggressive legal threats and limitless offshore funds. Now he was a high-value target in a multi-agency federal takedown facing a grim, brutal future without a single dollar to his name. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room unlocked with a loud metallic clank echoing sharply in the sterile space. Cameron shot up from the bolted aluminum chair, his eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. He expected to see the high-priced criminal defense attorney his mother had kept on a massive retainer. Instead, a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair and an impenetrable gaze walked into the room. It was Fletcher. Cameron exhaled a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. He collapsed back into the chair, practically sobbing with gratitude. He begged Fletcher to get him out of this nightmare, claiming that the tactical agents had made a catastrophic jurisdictional mistake. He babbled incoherently about a misunderstanding regarding the offshore wire transfers and begged the lawyer to post his bail immediately. Fletcher did not say a single word. He walked slowly to the metal table and placed his sleek leather briefcase on the scratched surface. He unclasped the brass locks with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. He did not offer Cameron a comforting smile or a reassuring handshake. He simply looked down at my son with an expression of profound, clinical disgust. Fletcher informed Cameron that he was severely confused about the nature of this visit. He stated in a voice as cold as glacial ice that he was not there to offer legal counsel or negotiate a bail hearing. He represented me. He was my personal attorney, and he was present strictly as a courtesy observer, authorized by the federal prosecutors leading the task force. The remaining fragments of Cameron's arrogance completely dissolved. His jaw dropped, and his breathing became rapid and shallow as the horrifying truth settled into his chest. He was entirely alone. His mother was currently locked in a separate interrogation room, fighting a losing battle against the dark web evidence. His wife was likely already negotiating a plea deal in another sector of the building. Fletcher reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small, heavy digital audio playback device. He placed it in the center of the metal table directly between them. He told Cameron that the federal prosecutors wanted him to hear a specific piece of evidence before the official interrogation commenced. Fletcher pressed a single button on the device. The high-definition audio recording filled the concrete cell with crystal-clear fidelity. Cameron's own voice echoed off the cinder block walls. He heard himself hyperventilating in the mountain cabin. He heard the distinct rustle of the decorative throw pillow being lifted from the leather sofa. He heard Diana's venomous whisper ordering him to be a man and suffocate his father. He heard his own panicked, desperate breathing as he knelt beside my head, preparing to commit premeditated murder. The recording captured every sickening, undeniable second of the conspiracy. It captured the exact moment he chose to trade his father's life for a $30 million insurance payout. The sound of the tactical breach, the shattering door, and his own cowardly surrender played out in excruciating detail. Fletcher let the silence stretch for a long, terrible moment after the audio finished playing. He calmly listed the charges the United States government was actively preparing against him. First-degree attempted murder, conspiracy to commit homicide, massive corporate embezzlement, federal wire fraud, obstruction of justice. He informed Cameron that the prosecutors were not offering any lenient plea deals or reduced sentences for the mastermind of the operation. The forensic accountants had already traced the $12 million back to his logistics firm, and the audio tape proved he was the primary physical aggressor in the cabin. Fletcher stated that Cameron was looking at a mandatory life sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the remote possibility of parole. Cameron stared at the audio device, his entire body shaking violently. The walls of the cell seemed to close in on him, crushing the last remnants of his sanity. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, obliterating any remaining loyalty he held for his family. He slammed his uninjured hand onto the metal table, his voice shrill and hysterical. He shouted that the entire plot was not his idea. He shrieked that Diana had orchestrated the poison and forced him to participate. He screamed that Monica had managed the offshore accounts and hidden the embezzled funds. He begged Fletcher to call the federal prosecutors back into the room immediately. He frantically promised to testify against his mother and his wife, offering to sign a full, comprehensive confession detailing their exact roles in the conspiracy to save himself from a life behind bars. It was the ultimate cowardly betrayal. He was willing to sacrifice the two women who had helped him build his criminal empire, just to shave a few years off his impending sentence. Fletcher simply nodded, slowly, packed his briefcase, and walked out of the cell, leaving my son entirely consumed by his own pathetic ruin. The walls of Interrogation Room 4 were painted a sickly, institutional beige that seemed to absorb all the light from the buzzing fluorescent tubes overhead. Monica sat rigidly in a bolted aluminum chair at the center of the sterile space. Her ruined suede shoes had been confiscated as material evidence, forcing her to wear standard-issue canvas slippers that clashed violently with her tailored cashmere sweater. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, projecting a fragile shield of corporate entitlement. For the first hour of her detainment, she had demanded her attorney. She had demanded a phone call. She had insisted that her arrest was a catastrophic overreach by the federal government and that her husband would be filing a massive civil rights lawsuit before dawn. She clung desperately to the illusion that Cameron was currently in the adjacent holding cell, leveraging his high-priced legal team to crush the investigators and secure their release. The heavy steel door clicked open, interrupting her silent, frantic calculations. A federal prosecutor walked into the room carrying a single manila folder. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer her a glass of water or engage in any standard interrogation pleasantries. He simply pulled out the metal chair opposite her and sat down. The screech of the metal legs dragging across the concrete floor made Monica flinch. The prosecutor opened the folder and slid a multi-page document across the scratched steel table. It was not a list of pending criminal charges. It was a formal sworn statement. At the bottom of the final page, sitting stark and undeniable in black ink, was Cameron's signature. The prosecutor calmly informed Monica that her husband had just brokered a comprehensive cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice. He explained that Cameron had provided a full chronological account of the $12 million embezzlement scheme to the lead investigators. He told her that Cameron had explicitly named her as the primary architect of the offshore routing architecture. Monica stared at the signature. Her breathing stopped entirely. The prosecutor continued turning the page to highlight a specific printed paragraph. He read Cameron's words aloud, detailing exactly how Monica had personally opened the Cayman Islands accounts and how she had manipulated the digital ledgers to bypass the internal security protocols of his technology firm. Cameron had completely abandoned her. He had traded her freedom for a fraction of judicial leniency. The manicured veneer Monica had spent years perfecting dissolved instantly under the harsh overhead lighting. Her jaw trembled. A low, ragged sound escaped her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had married a coward who would gladly step on her neck to keep his own head above water. The prosecutor leaned forward, bridging the physical gap between them. He informed her that the federal mandatory minimum for her specific role in the wire fraud and corporate embezzlement carried a penalty of 25 years without the possibility of early parole. He told her that Cameron had already secured the only available immunity deal for a cooperating witness in the financial sector of the case. Monica was entirely exposed. The panic consumed her logic and fractured her corporate composure. She slammed her hands flat against the metal table, her perfectly painted nails scraping against the cold steel surface. She shouted that Cameron was a pathetic liar. She screamed that he was too fundamentally incompetent to understand the offshore logistics, let alone mastermind the corporate bypasses. She declared that he was trying to save himself by throwing her directly into the fire. The instinct for absolute self-preservation hijacked Monica's brain. She realized that Cameron had beaten her to the prosecutor's desk. If she wanted to avoid spending the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary, she needed to offer the government a target with a significantly higher operational value. She looked frantically at the prosecutor, her eyes wide with desperate, calculating energy. She asked what the Department of Justice would offer her if she could deliver the actual mastermind of the execution plot. The prosecutor remained silent, allowing her desperation to steep in the sterile room. Monica leaned closer, lowering her voice to a frantic, conspiratorial whisper. She offered up Diana. She explicitly stated that her mother-in-law was the true architect of the lethal neurotoxin acquisition. She told the prosecutor that Diana had initiated the plot to manipulate the $30 million life insurance payout because her own secret financial reserves were running dry. To secure her deal, Monica revealed a hidden layer of the family conspiracy that even Cameron did not know existed. She confessed that Diana maintained a network of secure subterranean safety deposit boxes spread across 3 different private banks in the metropolitan area. Monica explained that she had personally helped Diana establish the clandestine accounts under a series of sophisticated corporate aliases years ago. She detailed the exact locations, the specific vault numbers, and the biometric passcodes required to access them. She promised the prosecutor that those boxes contained millions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds, raw diamonds, and physical gold bullion. It was Diana's ultimate shadow fund, a private fortune she had been hoarding outside of the family estate for over a decade. Monica traded her mother-in-law's hidden empire for a recommendation of a reduced sentence. The criminal alliance that had confidently planned my murder in a freezing garage just days ago had completely imploded. They were actively devouring each other exactly as the mathematical models of game theory predicted. The crushing pressure of federal incarceration had stripped away their familial bonds, leaving only pure, vicious self-interest. In interrogation room 7 at the far end of the federal corridor, Diana sat in total isolation. She had been left alone for nearly 2 hours. The tactical silence was a deliberate psychological weapon utilized by the federal agents to amplify her paranoia and degrade her stamina. Her expensive leather boots tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against the concrete floor. She had tried to invoke her right to counsel, but the agents had simply processed her paperwork and locked the heavy door without acknowledging her demands. She knew the silence meant they were building the case utilizing the evidence I had willingly surrendered from her wall safe. The realization that I had anticipated her moves and outmaneuvered her entirely pushed her into a state of aggressive hysteria. She began screaming at the 2-way mirror embedded in the wall. She demanded to speak to the lead investigator. She hurled wild accusations claiming the entire raid was an elaborate setup orchestrated by a senile, vindictive husband. When the door finally unlocked, she expected to see a team of federal prosecutors ready to negotiate. She expected an opportunity to utilize her charm and manipulation to steer the narrative back in her favor. I walked through the heavy steel door. I was not wearing handcuffs. I was not accompanied by an armed escort. I wore a tailored wool suit, perfectly pressed, moving with the calm, authoritative grace of a man who owned the building. The federal agents had granted me specific clearance to enter the holding area, a rare professional courtesy extended to a victim who had just handed them the largest financial prosecution of the decade. I stepped into the stark lighting of the interrogation room. Diana was physically secured to the heavy steel table. A thick metal chain connected her handcuffs to a bolted anchor point in the center of the surface, restricting her movement to a few pathetic inches. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute hatred and fundamental terror. Her flawless hair was tangled, and her face was streaked with ruined makeup. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, to hurl another frantic lie into the sterile air. I did not give her the opportunity. I simply pulled out the metal chair opposite her and sat down. My posture was relaxed. My breathing was steady. My expression was entirely devoid of emotion. I looked at the woman who had tried to stop my heart and watched the absolute reality of her destruction settle over her. The cold steel interrogation table separated us, acting as a physical manifestation of the massive chasm that had always existed in our marriage. Diana looked down at the heavy metal chain connecting her wrists to the bolted anchor point in the center of the surface. She took a slow, ragged breath, and when she looked back up, the feral panic from the cabin raid had completely vanished. In its place was a masterful display of manufactured vulnerability. I watched the transformation happen in real time. Her eyes welled with large, heavy tears that spilled perfectly over her lower lashes, tracing delicate paths down her pale cheeks. Her shoulders slumped forward, discarding the rigid posture of a cornered predator and adopting the soft, fragile slump of a victim. Her lower lip trembled precisely the way it had when she accidentally wrecked my first car 3 decades ago. It was the exact same engineered frailty she had weaponized throughout our entire life together. She used this specific frequency of weeping to dissolve my anger, to trigger my protective instincts, to twist my perception of reality until I was apologizing for her transgressions. She asked me a question, her voice catching on the syllables, playing the part of a devastated wife who could not comprehend the cruelty of a stranger. She asked why I had chosen complete annihilation. She sobbed, clutching her chained hands against her chest, asking why I did not simply file for divorce the moment I discovered the forged Canadian passports hidden in her wall safe. She wept uncontrollably, demanding to know why I had to destroy Cameron, our only child, instead of simply leaving the marriage with my assets intact. She framed my survival as an act of malicious vengeance, painting herself and our son as innocent collateral damage in my sadistic game. I did not move a single muscle. I did not offer a handkerchief. I did not reach across the scratched steel surface to comfort her. I sat perfectly still, observing the tears fall onto the metallic table with the clinical detachment of a forensic scientist studying blood spatter. For 35 years, that specific trembling tone in her voice had commanded my absolute devotion. It had driven me to work 90-hour weeks to secure the massive capital required to fund her endless appetite for luxury. It had blinded me to the subtle insults, the quiet manipulations, the slow, systematic isolation from my own friends and colleagues. Now watching her deploy the exact same biological trick, while facing a federal life sentence for attempted murder, I felt absolutely nothing. The immunity to her poison was absolute. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, bridging the physical distance between us. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, casting harsh green shadows across her wet face. She instinctively leaned into my proximity, anticipating the familiar capitulation, expecting me to soften and offer her a way out of her misery. My voice remained flat and quiet, forcing her to stop sobbing, to hear my words over the hum of the ventilation system. I told my wife that a divorce is a legal mechanism designed to negotiate the equitable division of shared assets between two partners who can no longer coexist. I explained that she had not sought a division of assets. She had sought a permanent bloody acquisition. I told her that orchestrating a lethal chemical execution using a dark web neurotoxin transcends marital dissatisfaction. I stated clearly that treason requires a complete and immediate forfeiture of all rights, privileges, and mercies. She stopped crying, her eyes widening as the cold logic of my words dismantled her performance. I kept my gaze locked directly on hers, stripping away the final protective layer of our shared history. I told Diana that I had known for nearly 2 decades that she felt absolutely no genuine affection for me. I recounted a specific evening 20 years ago when I overheard her mocking my blue-collar origins to her country club friends, reducing my grueling labor to a pathetic joke to entertain wealthy strangers. I told her I knew the marriage was a hollow transactional shell from that moment forward. Her breath hitched in her throat, completely unprepared for this historical revelation. She asked in a raw, genuine whisper why I had stayed in the house, why I had continued to fund the grand illusion, if I knew the absolute truth. I told her I stayed entirely to protect our son. I endured the frigid silence of our home and the constant financial drain to serve as an emotional buffer between her sociopathic narcissism and Cameron's developing mind. I stayed to teach him the value of honest labor, to provide a moral counterweight to her endless entitlement. I explained that I viewed my hollow marriage as a necessary personal sacrifice, a tactical deployment of my own happiness to ensure my son had a chance to become a decent human being. Diana stared at me, the tears drying completely on her cheeks as she processed the sheer magnitude of my silent, decades-long endurance. I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, resonant frequency. I told her that my protective mandate remained fully active until the precise moment I lay paralyzed on the woven rug of the mountain cabin. I told her I had waited praying that Cameron would refuse to participate in the physical execution. I had given him every opportunity to reject her poison, to call the local authorities, to show a single shred of the morality I had sacrificed decades to instill in him. He had chosen the $30 million payout. I described the exact moment Cameron had lifted the decorative throw pillow and pressed the heavy fabric toward my face. I told Diana that when my son chose to commit physical murder for capital, the biological and spiritual contract of fatherhood was irrevocably voided. He was no longer my child. He was simply a hostile operative executing a lethal threat against my life, and I neutralized him accordingly. The complete absence of mercy in my explanation finally broke her spirit. The engineered vulnerability vanished entirely, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of her impending federal incarceration. She realized that the gullible husband she had manipulated for 35 years was dead, and the man sitting across from her possessed zero residual affection. The sociopathic survival instinct took absolute control of her mind. She wiped her face with the back of her chained hands, discarding the weeping wife persona completely. She looked around the beige concrete room, calculating her immediate logistical requirements. She knew Monica had surrendered the offshore accounts and the hidden safety deposit boxes to the federal prosecutors. She knew her dark web communications were currently being cataloged as hard forensic evidence. She looked back at me, her voice stripping away the last remnants of human dignity. She begged for capital. She abandoned all pretenses of family or shared history and practically crawled across the table against her steel chains, demanding financial assistance for her legal defense. She pleaded with me to hire a premium criminal defense firm to transfer a fraction of my wealth into a retainer account so she would not be represented by an overworked public defender in federal court. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored wool suit. I withdrew my leather money clip, slowly sliding a single crisp $1 bill from the stack. I smoothed the paper out with my thumbs, ensuring it was perfectly flat. I placed the green bill exactly in the center of the scratched steel table right between her handcuffed wrists. I looked at the woman who had tried to end my life for an insurance payout. I told her that the piece of paper on the table represented the exact total value of her loyalty, her marriage, and her existence in my life. I pushed my chair back, the metal legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor. I stood up to my full height, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate precision. Diana stared at the single dollar bill, her mouth opening and closing in mute, absolute horror as the finality of the gesture crushed her. I did not say another word. I turned my back on my wife. I walked toward the heavy steel door, signaled the federal agent standing outside, and walked out of the interrogation room, forever leaving her chained to the table with her true worth. The mahogany desk in Fletcher's downtown office felt cold and unyielding beneath my hands as we finalized the systematic dismantling of my family. Fletcher spread the final stack of life insurance documents across the polished wood. The $30 million policy my wife and son had sought to trigger was officially nullified. Fletcher explained the precise legal mechanism at play. The conglomerate underwriting the policy had enacted a standard homicide exclusion clause entirely voiding the contract due to the active conspiracy to commit murder. The insurance executives had reviewed the federal indictments and the audio transcripts collected from the mountain cabin. They did not merely deny the massive claim. They actively joined the federal prosecution seeking compensatory damages for the fraudulent attempt to extract their capital. There would be no massive payout waiting for Diana or Cameron. The primary financial motivation that had driven my son to press a heavy pillow over my face was completely erased, leaving only the raw, undeniable consequences of his lethal ambition. Fletcher then shifted his meticulous attention to Diana's personal assets. The Federal Cybercrimes Division had fully decrypted the dark web transaction logs I had surrendered from her wall safe. The forensic accounting revealed a critical fatal error in my wife's operational security. To purchase the specialized cardiac neurotoxin, she had not used her hidden offshore reserves. She had routed the digital payment through a secondary domestic account tied directly to our shared marital trust. She had essentially used my own money to purchase the chemical weapon intended for my execution. Fletcher produced a devastating civil litigation brief based entirely on this specific unauthorized transaction. I was actively suing her frozen estate for the gross misappropriation of marital funds and seeking aggressive punitive damages for severe emotional distress and attempted wrongful death. The lawsuit effectively locked any remaining domestic capital she possessed behind an impenetrable wall of civil litigation, preventing her from accessing a single dollar to retain private legal counsel for her criminal defense. The financial guillotine descended even harder on Cameron, severing his access to the privileged world he had taken for granted. The $12 million he had embezzled from his logistics firm had triggered a massive automated response from the Internal Revenue Service. Fletcher detailed the absolute brutality of the federal tax code regarding stolen capital. Embezzled funds are legally classified as taxable income in the exact year they are acquired, regardless of their illicit nature. Because Cameron had hidden the money in the Cayman Islands and failed to report the massive income stream, he was immediately assessed with catastrophic tax evasion penalties. The federal government demanded millions of dollars in back taxes, exorbitant fines, and continuously compounding interest. To satisfy this monumental unpayable debt, the IRS executed immediate federal tax liens against every single legitimate asset my son owned, freezing his life completely. The liquidation process commenced with terrifying, unstoppable speed. Within 48 hours of the mountain cabin raid, aggressive recovery agents arrived at Cameron's luxury condominium in the bustling financial district. They operated with ruthless efficiency, repossessing his imported sports cars right out of the private parking garage, while his neighbors watched in stunned silence. The bank immediately foreclosed on the condominium itself, locking the heavy mahogany doors and placing a bright neon seizure notice directly on the expensive frosted glass. Every domestic bank account bearing his name was frozen and completely drained by federal authorities to pay the mounting tax penalties. His diverse stock portfolios, his secure retirement accounts, his meticulously cultivated corporate investments were entirely liquidated and transferred into government holding accounts. He was systematically stripped of every material possession he had accumulated, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the abrasive orange fabric of his county jail uniform. Diana suffered a similar total financial collapse. The secure subterranean safety deposit boxes Monica had revealed during her desperate plea deal were immediately raided by federal agents executing high-priority search warrants. The millions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds, rare raw diamonds, and heavy physical gold bullion she had hoarded for decades were confiscated as the direct proceeds of illegal activity. The government seized her entire shadow fund to pay the mounting restitution demands from the insurance conglomerate and the relentless federal auditing agencies. My wife had spent her entire adult life worshiping wealth and elevated social status, constantly measuring her worth by the balance of her hidden accounts. Now she was completely destitute. Without access to her hidden capital or the locked marital trust, she could not afford the high-powered defense attorneys she had always relied upon. She was forced to accept a junior court-appointed public defender, entirely unequipped to handle a complex federal conspiracy trial. They were both left with absolutely zero financial leverage to fight the crushing weight of the federal prosecution. With the legal and financial destruction fully enacted, I drove back to the sprawling suburban house. The late afternoon sun cast long, pale shadows across the perfectly manicured front lawn. The upscale neighborhood was perfectly quiet, the pristine brick facades hiding the chaotic, painful truths of the families living behind them. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand vaulted foyer. The air inside felt completely still, stagnant, and cold. For decades, this sprawling house had been a silent battleground of passive-aggressive tension, a theater where Diana performed her role as the devoted wife while silently plotting my demise. The quiet used to be a psychological weapon she wielded to punish me for perceived slights and manufactured grievances. I used to dread the suffocating silence, constantly walking on eggshells, to avoid triggering her sudden venomous temper. As I walked slowly through the pristine, immaculate rooms, the nature of the silence shifted fundamentally. It was no longer a suffocating, oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was simply peace. There were no false, accommodating smiles waiting for me in the kitchen. There were no shrill demands for expensive European vacations echoing down the wide hallway. There were no hushed conspiratorial phone calls taking place behind locked office doors. The toxic, draining energy that had saturated the drywall and the polished hardwood floors had been permanently excised. I walked into the spacious living room and stood exactly where Cameron had dropped to his knees, attempting to smother me. I looked at the expensive leather sofa, the imported Persian rugs, the carefully curated art pieces Diana had selected to project an image of perfect aristocratic success to our neighbors. The beautiful, expensive objects meant absolutely nothing to me now. I realized with absolute crystalline clarity that this massive structure was not a home. It had never truly been a home. It was a perfectly constructed hollow monument to a 35-year lie. Every piece of custom furniture, every square foot of polished Italian marble was purchased with money I had sacrificed my youth and vitality to earn just to satisfy a family that secretly despised my existence. I felt no emotional attachment to the impressive architecture. I felt no lingering nostalgia for the empty rooms where my son had grown up, because the decent boy I thought I raised had never actually existed. The blank walls offered no comfort, only the sterile echoing reflection of my own profound gullibility. I did not want to sleep in the massive master bedroom. I did not want to drink coffee in the pristine kitchen. I decided in that exact moment to sell the property to liquidate the final physical manifestation of my failed marriage and walk away entirely unburdened. The ink from my fountain pen dried quickly against the coarse grain of the commercial real estate contract. I sat across the polished conference table from the lead acquisitions director of a regional industrial development firm. He reviewed the addendums with a bewildered expression, entirely unable to comprehend the sheer financial magnitude of the concession I was offering. The sprawling suburban estate sitting on prime residential acreage was easily valued at $4 million on the open market. I was signing the deed over to his brutalist commercial holding company for a fraction of its appraised worth, requiring only a heavily discounted cash transaction. I had attached a single non-negotiable stipulation to the exceptionally generous transfer of property. The structural integrity of the residential architecture was to be systematically compromised and completely leveled within 72 hours. The acquisitions director nodded slowly, signaling his legal team to finalize the escrow. They viewed me as an eccentric, desperate seller, eager to liquidate assets for an immediate capital injection. They did not understand that I was purchasing an absolute erasure. I was paying for the definitive physical annihilation of a 35-year deception. I returned to the empty residence to execute the final phase of my logistical extraction. The vast, vaulted ceilings and sweeping marble corridors echoed with my deliberate footsteps. The ambient silence of the property was no longer the oppressive psychological weapon my wife had utilized to isolate and control me. It was the pure, unadulterated sound of permanent liberation. I walked up the sweeping mahogany staircase and entered the master suite for the last time. I bypassed the expansive walk-in closets filled with thousands of dollars of tailored formal wear, imported silk ties, and bespoke Italian leather shoes. Those garments belonged to a fabricated persona designed strictly to project the illusion of aristocratic success to our deceitful social circle. I had no further use for the costume of a compliant, oblivious husband. I retrieved a single rugged canvas and leather travel valise from the upper shelf. I packed exactly 7 days of practical utilitarian clothing. I included durable denim-heavy cotton shirts and a pair of worn comfortable boots. I left the expensive watches in their velvet display cases. I left the gold cufflinks in their wooden trays. I stripped my physical existence down to the absolute bare essentials, discarding the heavy, suffocating weight of material accumulation. I closed the leather valise, fastening the brass buckles with a sharp, definitive click. I walked through the silent corridors, trailing my fingers along the custom wainscoting, feeling the cold, rigid surface of the house one last time. I stepped out through the heavy front door, leaving it unlocked behind me. I walked to the edge of the sprawling, manicured lawn and stood beside the curb, breathing in the crisp morning air. The distant rumble of heavy diesel engines began to vibrate through the quiet suburban street. A convoy of massive industrial demolition equipment rolled slowly around the corner. Enormous yellow excavators with reinforced steel treads chewed up the pristine asphalt. A towering mobile crane equipped with a heavy iron wrecking ball cast a long, dark shadow over the elegant brick facade of the estate. The neighborhood was immediately thrown into a state of shocked disruption. Doors opened across the street as wealthy neighbors stepped onto their porches, clutching their morning coffee, staring in absolute horrified disbelief at the militarized construction vehicles surrounding my property. They had idolized the false perfection of my family and were now witnessing the brutal, uncompromising destruction of our primary monument. The site foreman approached me holding a clipboard. He requested the final authorization to commence the structural demolition. I gave him a single curt nod. The diesel engines roared to a deafening pitch, drowning out the panicked murmurs of the surrounding neighbors. The heavy excavator tracks crushed the immaculate landscaping, tearing deep, ugly trenches through the pristine green lawn and shattering the expensive imported sprinkler system. The crane operator maneuvered the heavy iron sphere backward, drawing it tight against the hydraulic cables to maximize the kinetic potential. I focused my gaze entirely on the second-floor windows, specifically targeting the corner architecture that housed Diana's private study. That room had been the nerve center of her deception, the sterile environment where she had calmly negotiated the purchase of a lethal neurotoxin to execute her husband. The operator released the brake. The massive iron ball swung forward with terrifying momentum. It struck the brick exterior with a concussive, devastating impact. The entire house groaned violently under the structural trauma. Mortar and shattered brick exploded outward in a massive cloud of gray dust. The ornate bay window shattered into thousands of jagged, crystalline fragments, raining down onto the ruined driveway below. A second swing completely compromised the load-bearing timber supporting the roof. The exterior wall of the study sheared away, exposing the immaculate interior to the harsh morning light. Through the settling dust, I watched the heavy biometric wall safe dislodge from its hidden compartment behind the shattered drywall. The steel vault plummeted through the compromised floorboards, crashing violently down through the lower levels until it slammed into the concrete foundation below, buried under a mountain of splintered wood and pulverized drywall. The physical manifestation of her dark web conspiracy, her forged passports, and her illicit financial ledgers was entirely consumed by the collapsing architecture. The house folded in on itself, a spectacular violent implosion of lies and engineered entitlement. A sleek black hired sedan pulled up to the curb, stopping precisely where the dust cloud dissipated. The driver stepped out, quietly opening the rear passenger door. I did not exchange a word with him. I handed him my single leather valise and stepped into the quiet, climate-controlled interior of the vehicle. The heavy door closed, sealing me off from the deafening mechanical violence of the demolition site. The car pulled away from the curb, smoothly accelerating down the tree-lined avenue. I did not turn my head to look out the rear window. I felt no lingering nostalgia, no hesitation, and zero remorse. The past was successfully liquidated. I pulled my encrypted mobile device from my breast pocket. The biometric scanner unlocked the screen, instantly connecting to the secure offshore financial gateway Fletcher had established on my behalf. I bypassed the primary authentication protocols and verified the massive incoming digital transfer. The remaining capital accumulated from my legitimate corporate acquisitions, completely untainted by Cameron's embezzlement or Diana's fraud, had successfully cleared the international holding accounts. The funds were now permanently locked inside an irrevocable blind trust located in a quiet sovereign jurisdiction entirely shielded from domestic litigation. The digital ledger confirmed my new legal identity, a sterile, uncompromised alias, supported by authentic government documentation. The coordinates entered into the sedan's navigation system indicated a coastal route leading toward a small, isolated harbor town where the cold mountain air was replaced by the relentless wash of the ocean tide. The fraudulent family structure had been systematically dismantled and eradicated. The architect of their ruin had completed his final objective. The silent adjustment was absolute. The ultimate lesson extracted from this ordeal is that true familial bonds are forged in mutual respect and absolute loyalty, not constructed upon the fragile foundation of material wealth. Blood relations do not grant an automatic pardon for toxic exploitation. When a family transforms into a parasitic entity, prioritizing capital over human life, the only rational response is to sever the connection with surgical precision. Authentic wealth is found in peace of mind, freedom from manipulation, and the quiet dignity of a life lived on your own uncompromised terms. Sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation requires the total destruction of the life you thought you knew. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more narratives of resilience and survival.